Well, welcome to today's installment of Prime Time at the BU Library. Prime Time is a collaborative project between friends of our BU Library, such as myself and sure many of the people in higher faculty development and many other offices on campus, celebrating learning beyond the classroom through the experiences and accomplishments of Bethel faculty, students, and staff. The schedule is filling in. If you'd like to see what's coming up, you can check the homepage at the new library website to see events that are listed. On Thursday, October 10th, someone named Chris Gerritz will present Pietism from the High Spirit to the Psalm, Holistic Education, the Ecclesiola, and Campus Studies. So find out what that mystifying title is about on Thursday at this time. Today we're welcoming Dr. Sara Shady from philosophy, Dr. Marion Larson from English, who will share Loving My Religious Other, focusing on the Pietist emphasis on active faith, love of neighbor, and an erenic spirit as they talk about interfaith dialogue. I should just get a little bit more background to this. Sara, Marion, myself, a few others, Kathy will be here in 3 weeks, I think, are contributing chapters to a new book coming out from InterVarsity Press called Whole and Holy Persons, A Pietist Approach to Christian Higher Education. So this is a way for us to preview, get some feedback on our chapters as we write them this fall. So we have 4 more, maybe 5 more in this series, so please stay tuned for further topics. Without further ado, Marion and Sara.
All right. For those of you who don't know us, I'm Marion, and this is Sara. And in the interest of time, I think we're just going to read the paper we've written, and we'll try to read it with expression and occasionally make eye contact with some of you.
And we have slides.
We do. We do have slides. Some of them are even more attractive than that one. So I think we'll just go that way, and then that ought to allow us some time for questions. We really appreciate input since we finished writing this yesterday. And so far it's only seen our 2 sets of eyes and our 2 brains. Edna Adan is known for her dedicated service to women's health in Somaliland. As the first trained nurse midwife in Somaliland, Edna built and now runs a women's maternity hospital, trains women in villages to perform proper and sterile midwife practices, and fights for women's health throughout the world. In the PBS documentary, Half the Sky, Edna describes her work with a passion that goes well beyond her academic training and cultural understanding. In her perspective, the development of the mind is not the only thing necessary to be of service to humanity. One must also cultivate the heart. At Educators at a Pietist University, we seek to integrate Edna's perspective into our work with students, believing that we must teach both minds and souls. In a 21st century context, it can be difficult, however, to do this at an explicitly Christian school in a manner that will effectively prepare students to serve in a religiously diverse world. Such preparation, we believe, must be deliberate in addressing the issue of religious diversity as a crucial part of developing intercultural competence. Navigating this issue requires that we think creatively about how to help students better understand their own views on spirituality, as well as how to interact with others who hold views on spirituality that are different from their own. We believe there are several aspects of a Pietist ethos that are consistent with and supportive of this type of interfaith education. In his book on August Franca, God's Glory, Neighbor's Good, Gary Sattler situates Franca and the larger Pietist tradition against the backdrop of Philip Spener's 6 pious desires. We believe 3 of these desires have direct application to the issue of educating students for service in a religiously diverse world. Specifically, Spener's desires that love might be practiced in everyday life, that Christians might have a better idea of how to behave in controversies with heretics and unbelievers, practicing love in controversy too, and that theological schools might stress piety as well as scholarship. In this chapter, we connect 3 Pietist themes with the work. We connect these 3 Pietist themes with the work of 2 leading contemporary Christian theologians who address the issue of Christian responsibility in a religiously diverse world, Brian McLaren and Miroslav Volf. For both McLaren and Volf, true Christian practice calls us to learn to meaningfully love all of our neighbors, even our religious neighbors. Learning to build and navigate relationships with persons of different faith traditions should never entail abandoning our own religious commitments. Instead, the strength of those commitments should prompt us to seek and sustain constructive relationships with all people we encounter. We believe we can prepare students for this sort of cultural engagement promoting Spener's desire for an active view of faith, a central commitment to love of neighbor, and an ironic spirit.
Okay, so what we're going to do is work through these three Pietist desires, connected them to the work of interfaith education. So first desire, that theological schools might stress piety as well as scholarship. An important aspect of interfaith education is that it allows students to grow in spiritual maturity while actively learning to practice being Christian in a diverse world. This is consistent with the Pietist ethos, which stresses an active living faith. As Sattler explains in his book on Franca, for Lutheran orthodoxies of the 17th and 18th centuries, faith was a noun, something, a body of propositions with which one agreed. For Franca, faith was a verb, an active way of being that was the necessary outworking of intellectual and emotional assent to the claim that Jesus is Savior. As Christian educators, affirming that faith is a verb implies a responsibility to extend learning beyond mere intellectual activity to actual engagement with real people in the world beyond our campus. A fairly common experience shared by many of our Christian students participating in interfaith dialogue for the first time is surprise at the diversity of religious beliefs they encounter and the sincerity with which those views are held. As one of our evangelical students noted after his first dialogue, I always thought everyone in America was either a devout Christian or a devout atheist. I never met people before who took other faiths seriously. Engaging students in interfaith dialogue can broaden their experience beyond classroom learning. It can be incredibly powerful to move students beyond the learning that takes place from reading books about other faiths and through classroom discussion. While we can often accomplish a great deal by having students encounter different views from texts and films, speeches, a greater depth of learning can come from personal experience. After all, as Robert Wuthnow, the sociologist of religion, notes, I must consider new ideas heard directly from my religious neighbor differently than if I simply read about them in a book or considered them in the abstract. We believe this type of direct learning our students need to have in order to fully engage the world beyond our campuses. At Interfaith Dialogues, our Christian students have had the opportunity to hear firsthand the story of a man who was ostracized in high school for being Jewish, or a woman who converted to Islam because of the emphasis on peace in that tradition, only to find that she was subsequently perceived as dangerous. While listening to members of the Baha'i tradition, which most of our students never knew existed, they not only learned that the principles of this faith but also about the experience of being misunderstood and ignored by society at large. Students also learned that many Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, and Christians share similar values, such as justice and equality. Specific to the role of educators at Christian colleges, we're not merely trying to develop good citizens, but we also seek to help our students develop spiritual maturity. Engaging students in direct interaction with persons of other faith traditions creates an opportunity for spiritual growth and learning outside of the campus bubble that's characteristic of many campus communities. Stepping outside of this bubble can challenge students to reflect on their faith in new ways. They develop religious literacy as they learn more about traditions that differ from their own. And hearing people from other faith traditions talk about their faiths instead of learning about religions indirectly can help our students recognize which of the assumptions about that faith tradition are accurate, which are stereotypical, misguided, or wrong. They also come to understand that just as not all Christians think alike, so also not all Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, or Baha'i think alike. Students who have participated in interfaith dialogues also become the bearers of what McCormick calls responsible belief, having a clear understanding of why they believe what they believe, as well as why others don't believe it. And they learn firsthand lessons about how to live out the Christian responsibility of hospitality, to welcome the stranger in their midst and love the neighbor who is different from their usual neighbors. Even while recognizing this call to welcome and love, some of our evangelical Christian students are concerned that their very participation in interfaith dialogue will imply that they agree with everything they're hearing, that the distinctives of Christianity will be lost in the process. But this isn't necessarily true. It is possible to listen, seek to understand, and even come to appreciate aspects of another religious tradition without compromising commitments to one's own religion. In these efforts, differentiating between theological and civic issues can be essential. Topics such as salvation or the divinity of Christ, for example, are theological issues likely to elicit significant disagreement between people of different faiths, and there are times for consideration of such issues. But individuals can disagree over theological issues while still seeking to come together with people of other faiths by emphasizing the similarities in what theologian Miroslav Volf calls our socially relevant knowledge of God. That is, the emphasis that many religions place on love of God and love of neighbor. In other words, one doesn't need to uphold theological pluralism in order to promote civic pluralism. Affirming civic pluralism allows us to put faith into action by working for the common good. As McLaren explains, interfaith engagement is actually a living version of God, which at root means reconnecting or rebonding broken relations with God, with neighbor, with stranger and enemy, with non-human life, with all creation. For McLaren, active engagement with others in a pluralistic context actually deepens and strengthens one's faith because it challenges us to really live out the central command of Christianity, to love both God and neighbor. McLaren asks, could it be that our core doctrines are even more wonderful and challenging than we previously imagined, asking us not simply to assent to them in the presence of our fellow assenters, but to practice them in relationships with those who don't hold them? Could our core doctrines in this way become healing teachings? This sentiment is echoed in Franca's sermon, Duty to the Poor. As Franca writes, one shows oneself as a Christian so far as one is a true person of prayer before God and practices love toward neighbor. Otherwise, it's all empty talk.
The Pietist emphasis on faith as action, not mere assent, is also reflected in the Pietist understanding of Christ's command to love our neighbors. For Pietists like Franca and Spener, a genuine Christian faith must manifest itself in a total commitment of life to God and neighbor. For Pietist Johanna Eleonora Peterson, Christian faith must join love of God with love of neighbor. As Michelle Clifton Soderstrom describes, Peterson never lived as though her faith was private. She found God by loving her neighbors and praying for her enemies. She lived a life of ongoing conversion to God, and in doing so, she was receptive to others. As these Pietists remind us, love isn't just an intellectual perspective or an emotional disposition. It is active. But in the context of interfaith interactions, what might this love look like? And several of the ideas that I'm going to be talking about next come mostly from Miroslav Volf. Many of them he touches on in one of his newer books on Allah, Christian Responses to Islam. So first of all, love listens and receives. We demonstrate love of our religious neighbor when we listen with a generous spirit, willing to receive and learn. This may sound obvious, but it can be much more difficult than it seems, particularly for those convinced of the truth of Christianity. Listening often consists of looking for flaws in what the other person has to say, mentally preparing for ways to demonstrate the superiority of Christianity over the other person's religion. But this kind of selective listening is far from loving. Even when communicating with religious neighbors in situations of great need, Anthony Gittins reminds Christians that, quote, we must never forget that we go to real people living in real situations amid real problems, but that these people have real wisdom and real aspirations. To overlook these truths would lead to our patronizing others and ultimately treating them as no better than objects, end quote. Instead of objectifying others through selective listening, we ought to practice humility, a genuine openness to being taught. At the very least, we Christians can demonstrate our willingness to be taught about other religions by listening to our religious neighbors provide an insider's perspective on what it's like to be, say, Jewish or Muslim or Buddhist. Such listening can help us come to see others through their own eyes, not just our own, as we pay receptive attention to their own story about who they see themselves to be, says Volf. Receptive attention includes practicing what Volf calls hermeneutical hospitality, as we seek to enter sympathetically into others' efforts to interpret their sacred text. The goal of such attentive listening, says Kuster, is, quote, to understand the religious other in a way that the other can recognize himself or herself in my perception. But our listening shouldn't stop there. Love demands that we try to see our religious neighbors as they see themselves, and to see ourselves as others see us. Of course, we may not always like what we hear when we learn how our religious neighbors perceive Christians, but we cannot hope to mend old wounds if we don't even know what those wounds are. We cannot hope to love our neighbors if we don't know what love looks like to them. Christians can also learn from their religious neighbors by listening to the insights and experiences gained from various spiritual disciplines and practices that are common to numerous religions. For example, at an iftar in a local Islamic center, one Muslim student talked with our students about the way in which the Ramadan fast helped him develop deeper compassion for those who never have enough to eat. At another interfaith event, a Jewish woman who had recently lost her mother reflected on the soul formation that she was experiencing as a result of saying Kaddish in community with others who had experienced similar losses, yet who sought to honor God amid their grief. Not only do we Christians stand to gain much as we listen to such stories, but we also demonstrate love by respecting the image of God in others and seeing their potential contributions as being of equal value to ours. Volf sums up this attitude toward our religious neighbors when he says, quote, "So what is a Christian way to see oneself in relation to others? It is very simple," he says. "Commanded as Christians are to love their neighbors as themselves, their stance should be that of discerning generosity toward others, toward them as persons, as well as toward their beliefs and practices." So we show our love to our religious neighbors when we listen attentively and show our willingness to learn from them. Such listening is also crucial if we are to demonstrate love by fighting prejudice against religious others. This is the case, says Volf, because the best way to fight prejudice is by knowledge, not just knowledge of people's beliefs and practices, but knowledge of their feelings and hopes, their injuries and triumphs as well. If Volf is right, then Christians have a lot of learning to do, both about other religions in general and about individual religious neighbors we encounter. It also means we need to be deliberate in seeking out such encounters, and then in counteracting falsehoods and misperceptions expressed by fellow Christians about other faiths. Of course, this is easier said than done, in part because each of us has preconceptions about other religions that get in the way. For example, many Christians describe Christianity as a religion of grace, whereas they describe other religions, such as Islam, as more legalistic, centered on human efforts to please a demanding God. As one of our evangelical Christian students noted, to Muslims, Allah is a severe reckoning force. Christians believe in an all-powerful God, yet he is gentle to his beloved. He is a father. Christians holding such an understanding of Islam tend to hear comments about Allah's greatness or power or holiness as confirmation of their views, even though they themselves might speak of Christians as worshiping a powerful and holy God whose judgments are extreme at times, and this God who is described in the Bible as fierce. Their preconceptions about other religions make it difficult for them to see the many parallels between their own Christian beliefs and those held by their Muslim neighbors. These preconceptions tend to magnify differences and contribute to the religious prejudice that leads to violence. And I'm not saying, we're not saying, nor is Volf saying, that there are no differences between religions. We're just talking about inserting differences unnecessarily. We can start fighting prejudice simply by reminding ourselves that preconceptions can distort, and by recognizing our human tendency to focus on what makes our beliefs look good and what makes the beliefs of others look inferior. Failing to recognize this makes it impossible for us to interact lovingly with our religious neighbors. Speaking as a Christian, Volf addresses his Muslim neighbor when he says that, quote, "My distorted image of you dishonors you. I do you injustice by clinging to it. If I care for you, I will want my image of you to do you justice." We demonstrate love of our religious neighbors then when we seek to be truthful about the other as well as about ourselves, and when we speak truthfully about our religious neighbors to fellow Christians. We demonstrate love for our religious neighbors by listening and learning as well as by fighting religious prejudice. Although there is much to be learned by listening to others, at times Christians also wish to speak of their faith in hopes that others may be attracted to Christ. There is a long and vibrant history of missions among Pietist Christians, motivated by love of Christ and love of neighbor, and frequently accompanied by acts of service. Early Pietist, Franca, for example, promoted medical missions in India, keenly aware of the responsibility that these Christian missionaries had to be mindful of the well-being of the people in their care. Many Christians throughout the history of the church have seen missionary efforts as the primary way to show love for religious neighbors. Love certainly might, and often does, motivate mission work, but Volf argues that many of our religious neighbors don't see mission work and various evangelistic efforts as reflections of love. There may be numerous reasons for this, of course, some of which, like failure to listen and learn or failure to combat religious misinformation and prejudice, we have already discussed. In addition to these reasons, Volf identifies what he describes as a failure to be guided by the golden rule when we speak of Christ to our religious neighbors. The golden rule of witnessing tells us, quote, "Witness to others in the way you think others should witness to you." It seems obvious then that we would avoid tactics such as those used by street corner preachers who point fingers at passers-by, shouting insults and accusations. It also seems obvious that we would oppose various scare tactics that some Christian youth groups use in order to impress teenagers with the seriousness of sin and the horrors of hell. Perhaps less obvious, though, is our tendency to compare the best practices of our own faith with the worst practices of the other faith, says Volf. This, too, demonstrates a violation of the golden rule, a failure to love our religious neighbor as we love ourselves. The golden rule of witnessing also tells us to witness to others only if you are prepared to let them witness to you, says Volf. Many of our religious neighbors take their spiritual lives and religious practices seriously, just as Christians seek to do. Our failure to listen with care and attention to what they have to say demonstrates a lack of regard, a lack of love. Christian missionaries are often professional givers, says Gittin, but they may not always acknowledge the desire and rights of others to give as well. In our concern for all we, quote, do for others, are we perhaps insensitive to what the others try to or might like to do for us, he asks. McLaren reimagines Christian missions in a similar way. He explains, sharing is never a one-way street. It is always about receiving as well as giving. In generosity, we freely share our treasures with people of other faiths without requiring them to convert. And in the same spirit, we gratefully receive the treasures generously offered to us by other faiths without needing to convert. This is particularly important to keep in mind if we hope to demonstrate love for neighbors from religions such as Islam that take their own call to missions very seriously. Even if we seek to treat our religious neighbors with respect and love, listening attentively so that we can learn and receive at least as much as we might hope to give, we still will at times offend without meaning to do so. And we will almost certainly encounter neighbors who have been hurt by other Christians. This reality provides yet another reason why it is so important for Christians to take the time to have actual conversations with religious neighbors, for we might not otherwise learn about the pain that has been done to others in the name of Christianity. Unfortunately, even the best of intentions can't guarantee a good outcome. In such circumstances, love of neighbor includes coming to take responsibility for the harm that we and others have done in the name of religion. As Spener writes in Pious Desires, let us therefore be diligent in investigating even more deeply our own shortcomings and those of the rest of the church.
The third of the Pious Desires we're looking at today. That Christians might, among other things, practice love in controversy too. Living for God's glory and neighbor's good is often easier to think about than to practice. According to McLaren, the biggest obstacle to establishing and sustaining healthy relationships with persons of different faith traditions is fear. As he explains, your greatest obstacle will be in you, mine will be in me. In the end, it is not the threats of others that cause me to shrink back, but rather my own fear. So as educators, we must train students to engage difference with courage and civility. McLaren recognizes that fear of other religions is not only problematic because fear might prevent us from entering into dialogue with those who believe differently, Additionally, fear can easily harden into religious hostility and conflict. According to McLaren, Christians in contemporary America suffer from what he calls conflicted religious identity syndrome. This label describes the tension between wanting to love my neighbors on the one hand, and at the same time being afraid that such love betrays my commitment to the truth of my own faith tradition. At root is often a belief that Christianity actually requires opposition toward other faiths, leaving believers without a clear understanding of how to be a genuine Christian without taking a hostile stand toward other views. The Pietist ethos advocates that we approach conflict with an ironic spirit. We hear a lot about that on our campus. We don't always know what that means, right? This does not mean that we find peace simply by avoiding disagreement, nor does it mean that we must embrace all views as equally true. Rather, having an ironic spirit means we speak our view of the truth with love and sincerity, and we charitably respect the other's point of view as well. Once again, the Pietist ethos reminds us that how we act is just as important as what we believe. Franke describes an ironic approach in his scriptural rules of life. First, Franke emphasizes that our action should be of more priority than our words, explaining, "Do not force yourself to speak much, but if God gives you an opportunity to speak, speak with respect, after mature consideration, gently, as much as you have certainty, with loving sincerity." Second, not only should our own actions serve as a witness to our faith, but citing examples of virtue within our own tradition can be far more effective than engaging in theological debate. As Franke advises, do not let good, and especially living examples of virtue, and ones which bear witness to divine providence, omnipotence, goodness, and justice escape your memory, for one can edify much with that. Finally, Franke recognizes that we will not always be able to reach agreement in conflict. When disagreement remains, we should avoid taking a hostile position toward the other. According to Franke, if you have presented the truth clearly and with good arguments, be satisfied. You will gain little with further quarreling. Your opponent will consider the matter more if he sees that you are certain of your subject and will not quarrel. Should he learn nothing more from you, at least he may learn gentleness and modesty from your example. Consistent with this Pietist mindset, McLaren's solution to the tension regarding our relationships to other faiths requires that we change how we think about our own Christian identity. Rather than believing that our faithfulness to Christianity is demonstrated toward hostility regarding other views, our faithfulness can be made manifest in the way we bear witness to Christ through our love of others. McLaren explains, "My understanding of Jesus and his message leads me to see each faith tradition, including my own, as having its own history, values, strengths, and weaknesses. I seek to affirm and celebrate all that is good in each faith and tradition. And I build intentional relationships of mutual sharing and respectful collaboration with people of all faith traditions, so all our faiths can keep growing and contribute to God's will being done on earth as it is in heaven." For McLaren, the switch from hostility to solidarity actually puts us more in line with the central teachings of Christianity. This affirms that our core identity as Christians are to be those who love God and neighbor above all else. As educators, it's crucial that we avoid teaching other religions from the perspective that they are the enemy. As McLaren explains, when we increasingly understand who we are in relation to an enemy, whether that enemy is legitimate, innocent, or imaginary, we develop an increasingly hostile identity. Such an identity teaches us to see sameness as safety and otherness as danger. It's characterized by duality, us versus them, right versus wrong, good versus evil, light versus darkness. It promotes a mentality of us versus them, us apart from them, us instead of them, us without them, us over them, us using them, us in spite of them, us oppressed by them, or us occupying them, but never as us for them or us with them. Preparing our students to live constructively in the midst of religious diversity requires that we help them learn to look for truth and goodness even beyond the boundaries of their own view of the Christian truth. This can mean asking them to listen charitably before critiquing, to make sure they really understand how someone from a different faith views the world. And this listening stage provides the space for students to identify points of commonality in addition to points of difference between views. From these points of commonality, one builds the solidarity to maintain a spirit of love and be agents of peace, even in controversy. We don't need to agree, says Volf. We just need to be civil rather than mean-spirited when we disagree. So in conclusion, Michelle Clifton Soderstrom begins her book on Pietism, which is titled Angels, Worms, and Boogies, with the following statement, bogies, sorry. I always think boogeyman, but then boogies means something entirely else. So angels, worms, I do have boys. Angels, worms, and bogies. With the following, okay, she begins the book with the following statement from Galatians chapter 5, verse 6. The only thing that counts is faith working through love. As Christian educators at a Pietist institution, this is a central theme of our commitment to developing whole and holy persons. We desire to cultivate students with mature faith commitments ready to take their academic skills to serve others in the world at large. The 21st century context in which these students will live and serve is increasingly diverse, a highly connected, interdependent, and religiously mixed world. As a rule, many religions inhabit common political space. This means that, increasingly, interfaith interactions must become part of our lives. In these interactions with our religious neighbors, we must, says Volf, avoid inconsistency. The way you think about others and act toward them should never clash with the beliefs about God you espouse and seek to commit to them. So, if we have time for questions and comments, thoughts.
So I'm wondering if, so take a conservative Christian view that's probably very commonly held by our students, that people who are in other religions and who do not accept Christ are going to hell. I can't quite see how holding that is consistent with taking the position that you said, that you've been describing. I mean, if you think that they are going to hell if they don't change their beliefs, then treating them with love is, top priority. Treating them with love is to have them eventually somehow come to believe what you do. And you're not thinking of them necessarily as the enemy, but maybe you're thinking of them sort of like they're drowning, right? So it's not like their religion is the enemy or they're the enemy, but they're drowning. And I just wonder if this approach to interfaith dialogue just assumes that that's false, that conservative Christian view is false.
I'll start and then you
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think I'll give a Miroslav Volf answer. And first of all, I don't know if he would say that view is false or true. But he would say it's a reality that we share the world with people from a variety of religions. We share this country with a variety of adherents to a variety of religions. Christianity is far from center stage anymore in terms of its influence. So he in his book Allah, one of the things he talks about is he says there are times to focus on theological. He doesn't make the theological civic distinction. He says issues of soteriology versus issues of, so what does your faith tell you about how you ought to live right now? And so I think that's part of what we're trying to argue is,
Right,
go ahead.
If I think about what I do with this in the classroom, because you're exactly right, and I'll get students, who hear of an interfaith service event or encounter something in class, email me or come to talk to me with this very concern. And so what I try to do from an educational standpoint is approach from a different angle. And the angle is, once you leave the Bethel bubble, you are going to work with, live near, people who believe very differently from you. And yes, you can perceive these people as drowning. But then the question becomes, what's the most effective way to communicate the truth of the gospel? And often, a lot of our ways are ineffective and actually do more harm to the person then good. So if you want to save somebody from drowning, you've got to know effective lifeguarding, techniques. You've got to do it in the right way. And so one of the approaches is, okay, so how do I learn to communicate love? How do I to communicate the gospel in a loving way? I mean, one of McLaren's points in his book, it's actually the most effective things Christians could be doing around the world is loving better. And if we loved better, that's actually quite magnetic. And so, to the point of, do we have a responsibility to witness to and save others? Yes, let's think effectively about how we do that and what it's like to be these people and what it's going to be like to be on the cubicle next to a Somali employee, coworker, who, no matter what you say, isn't, what are you going to do when you share the cubicle wall and the person didn't convert and you've got to work together on a project? So you sort of have the practical as well as the theoretical going on.
I would say even from that conservative viewpoint, though, that it's never been up to us to convert somebody. And so we love people, we share the gospel with them, and it's God's job. And it's not. So I don't see that as being inconsistent with what they were sharing here, in the sense that you can still have a deep belief these people are going to hell without Christ, but it's not, I can't, and in some sense, it's up to them to make that, it's up to them and God to work out their salvation, not me, other than to be the means of presenting the gospel to them.
I guess my question then is how much is this dialogue really a two-way? If you think they're going to hell if they continue to believe what they're believing? I mean, that was one of the...
Right. And I think from an educational standpoint, this comes in stages. So, this student who's really hardened into this hostile, they wouldn't call it hostile, they'd call it faithful view of how I should approach other religions. There's a process of learning what other religions really think, how other religious people really act and inhabit their worlds. So I think there's a long stage of that educational process of where, and I think not all students are going to change their mind about that, but I think we do have a responsibility as educators to make sure that they're thinking critically and holistically about who our religious others really are and how we should interact with them.
Well, the other thing I was going to add is some of the things that Volf talks about, especially regarding love of neighbor. If we really believe that all people are made in God's image, and that of course that image has been flawed by sin, again, in all of us, all people are made in God's image, then what are the implications of that? And I think that people like Volf, for example, emphasize some of the really positive implications of that and encourage us to pay more attention to it. And so to assume the example of the Jewish woman saying Kaddish, that was a conversation that I participated in, and with a woman who's very committed to Judaism, very knowledgeable about her faith, and I learned so much about prayer, about the importance of community in prayer, about how it can be soul-forming to affirm something you're not sure you feel right now. That is, praise be to God. How that can be so soul-forming, even when I don't feel it. That I didn't need to sit there and think, oh my gosh, she's Jewish, it's too bad she doesn't love Jesus. That wasn't at all what I thought. Instead, I thought, this is a person with a depth of spiritual wisdom that goes far beyond me. And that I know that Volf would say, and that there clearly is God. God is in that. What that means, I don't know. And you notice we're not theologians, and so the part of our paper we're not going to say is, oh, and by the way, this is how God thinks about all of this.
I think my response to that as a sociologist, I teach religion in society, is that the reason why this question becomes really very important is simply because the United States is a superpower, and Christianity has been a dominant religion in the world. We are living in a world that has been shaped by Judeo-Christian civilization. Just imagine that if the religion of the United States was Buddhism. If there's a Christian in India, well, they would have to deal with that because United States is a powerful civilization and our religion is Buddhism. So we're living in a world where other religions are living in our space. So I can be here in Bethel and just say, well, we Christians believe this and that or whatever, but somebody can be very wealthy enough in India and Saudi Arabia and build a university as good as Bethel and tell their students that the only way you can go to heaven is to believe in Prophet Muhammad or whatever. So if this is what we do in the world, people in every religion build their own university and they get professors trained in any university and they just tell their students that this is just your belief. I don't see that as really helping us. So I myself had to go through a very serious reflection about this, because otherwise I can say, yeah, my faith is this and that's it. But if today America is not a superpower, or Christianity is going to have a totally different perception. As somebody who lives in the global south, I can tell you that this is really true. But if you live in this country, you combine your Christianity with Christian identity and citizenship and whatever, you take things for granted, but it's not, we cannot take that for granted.
Carol?
I'm just wondering if this research and thinking has been applied to people having respect for different parts of the family of Christianity, having grown up in one stream, worked in another, and worshipped in yet another. It seems to me that that might be a starting point for trying to listen to other people of our own faith.
And it might be worth it for us to figure out how to work that theme into the paper, because, and especially historically in the Pietist tradition, that's one of the ecumenicism was one of their hallmarks, during the Reformation, and even towards Catholicism, a spirit of ecumenicism. And so we were applying that in terms of thinking, okay, how is the world different in 2013 than it was in 1613? But certainly there are ecumenical applications to this as well. When we think about our religious neighbors, it doesn't mean necessarily someone who's not Christian.
I think we're at the end of our time. Thank you, Sara and Marion, for getting us off to a great start. This was just fantastic. We just off-campus study, how that relates to Pietism. We've got several of our other speakers here. Kathy, I believe she'll be here on the 29th. I think Ray is the week after that. Samuel's the week after that. So stay tuned for more in this series as we continue into fall.